presentarme un poquito en español, pero hablar en inglés, porque mi intervención, claro, va a ser complicada, es un mundo complicado y intento juntar dos, como decía antes Ricardo, dos mesas redondas, cada una muy diferente. Voy a intentar añadir unos matices a la primera mesa redonda que tuve el privilegio de escuchar hace un momento, que encontré muy bien y muy interesante. Entonces, matizar en vez de poner, supongo, y después hacer el puente, como decía Ricardo, a la segunda mesa redonda sobre la estrategia empresarial. Quiero decir, claro, encantado de estar aquí con Cesce y Ricardo, encantado de conocerle a todos sus colegas y gracias por haber organizado esto. Ahora, y claro, las preguntas en español muy bien. Ahora al inglés. Vamos a practicar su inglés. You don't have to speak it, you just have to understand it. Right, let me use my time. Got to keep an eye on the clock there. Talk about four things. I'm going to use lots of numbers because I need to organize what I'm going to say here as we're doing the world. Let me say, first of all, some things about where are we? Where are we today? Secondly, where are we going? Third, what does it mean for business? And then a little bit some of the choices I think businesses are going to have to make given its impact of globalization. So starting a little bit first of where we are, as I think you heard in the first presentation, we are certainly in a geopolitical divide. I'll come to the Cold War thing in a minute. But I think there are 7 main features of where we are today. And it really has evolved since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, February last year, through to today. And each of these, in a way, is building on the other and creating the force that is driving the next 3, 5, 4 years that we'll be looking at. First point, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has split Europe. It's split it between Russia and Belarus, pretty much the only two, and the rest of Europe. And in my mind, I don't see any capacity for going back to the status quo ante. You can't go back to where we were before for a long time. In a way, you could say it's a new Iron Curtain. A new Iron Curtain is falling down across Europe. I would add that sanctions are very easy to impose. Sanctions are very difficult to lift. I've worked in Washington for 15 years. They've still got sanctions going back to whenever, you know. So that's the first point about where we are. Second point, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has forced China to choose, and to choose Russia. It's a choice I think the leadership in Beijing did not want to have to make. We all know that China and Russia do not trust each other. You know, in a way, Russia would rather look west and protect itself against China, but that's not the choice that's on the table. So I've had China and Chinese people in particular say to me, Robin, no, we don't trust Russia. You know, you keep talking about this alignment. We don't trust them. I said, that's not the point. It's about a hierarchy of interests. And in that hierarchy of interests right now, Russia, in China's mind, Russia cannot afford to lose the war. If Russia loses the war, America and its allies are reinforced. They are then in a stronger position to contain, back to the panel we just heard, China. And there's another dimension as well. If Russia were to lose the war, if Putin were to be humiliated, he might lose power. If he loses power, there could be chaos in Russia. And if there's one thing that the Chinese deeply fear, is chaos at their back, behind them, at the same time when they're out facing America and its allies in front of them. I think Xi Jinping used the term, not in English, but it's been translated as being back-to-back. Russia and China are physically, with a few Central Asian states here and there, but they are physically, geographically back-to-back. And so their relationship has become more and more economic, and it will become more and more economic. Russia will supply China, not just with its energy needs, but the materials for China's own energy transition to green energy sources. It's a military relationship. They're not selling them weapons right now. We know they're not selling them weapons, at least not directly. But it was interesting that just last week, Putin welcomed to Moscow, after having welcomed Xi Jinping, he welcomed Li Shangfu, the new defense minister of China, who, by the way, is on American sanctions list for having sold weaponry to Iran before he became the defense minister. That's a pretty big signal to make, certainly, both on the Chinese and the Russian side. And in the end, the Chinese want to buy high-end military technology from Russia. Sure, the Russians need shells and they need ammunition right now, but the military relationship will probably evolve in the future. They're teamed up on communications, on explaining this war. And although the Chinese keep saying, we haven't, we're not providing material support, we're not selling weapons, we're not breaking the SWIFT financial sanctions. Our trade is growing, but it's not a crazy amount. But what they forget is that by supporting the narrative, the Russian narrative of the war, that this is a defensive war, they tell all the other countries in the world, this is just another fight between old Cold War enemies. It's fine to trade with Russia. And Russia is trading with the rest of the world. There's only roughly 40 countries out of 190 imposing sanctions on Russia right now. And the last thing about their relationship, and so I want to really emphasize how close it's becoming, is it's institutional. And again, we heard on the last panel this emphasis that China is putting on reforming or re-emphasizing the principles behind the UN. And Russia is very much a team of theirs, and I'll come to that in a minute. So this is a really important relationship. This is not just a momentary thing. Now, this is very important for the third of where we are now, of the 7 things. Russia's invasion of Ukraine and China's willingness to support it, at least rhetorically, has fused, linked together China and Russia in the minds of most policy leaders in Europe and America. They've started to become, they're not the same, they're different, they're not both threats, and many of our governments are find it very difficult to try to explain how they can both cooperate and have a cooperative relationship and trade with China and at the same time think of it as a rival. But the issue I did want to take up a little bit with Carlotta, I suppose, is that I think it is ideological. In the end, each government, certainly American government and the Chinese government, fear each other's system of government. The Chinese fear, always, they're a communist party, they're a one-party state, they're a secret society that now runs a country. They fear that at some point America will drive a color revolution. It'll drive democracy somehow into China. And Taiwan, we'll come to it later, but I've always described Taiwan, it's like the missile of democracy sitting off the shore of China. You think of Cuba, which had real missiles potentially facing America. That was fixed. But as long as Taiwan exists and succeeds and thrives, it's a democratic China, of a sort of democracy that the Communist Party cannot accept. And so the fear is that America, in a way, is trying to seed a color revolution into China constantly. So that fear of America ideologically is important. Of course, the Americans also fear Communist China, partly for the ideology. And this, I would say, would apply to more than just Americans. The view that autocratic governments are fundamentally insecure. It's fine when things are going well, but they're always worried that somebody's going to undermine them. Therefore, they need buffer states. They need states around them that can act as a buffer to protect them from external interference. So what autocratic governments tend to do is project. And certainly, as people have said, China would like to make the world safe for their system of government, one-party governments. And the Belt and Road Initiative certainly supported that aim. I guess I could say more about that, but let's just park that idea. There is an ideological dimension to it, and it's being formalized right now in this focus by Western governments on the Communist Party of China. So the new committee that was set up in the United States when the Republicans took control of the House of Representatives is called something like the Select Committee on Strategic Competition with the Communist Party of China. Not with China. And if you read a lot of recent British papers, they talk about having a conflict with the Communist Party of China, as if you could separate the two, but you can't. So it's a fake, in a way, separation. But it reminds you how ideological this is. And when you connect that ideology with Xi Jinping's commitment to what is described as civil-military fusion, you fuse the civil technologies with military technologies, you can understand why we are at the front end of a series of trade restrictions being imposed by the Americans and Europeans on China, which have been discussed in the last panel. We can talk more about it later. Each of these things connect. My fourth point now connects from the third. This idea of China and Russia in a way being interconnected as two autocratic states that need each other and that in a way will project their insecurity on the rest of the world has led to a knitting together for the first time ever, of America's transatlantic and trans-Pacific alliances. These have traditionally been two separate worlds. When I worked in Washington, I was part of the transatlantic community. I worked on US, Europe. We all knew each other. We were a community. And then you had the American specialists on Japan, on China, on Taiwan, on South Korea. They were a community. And the American government sort of managed them separately. Now, slowly, incrementally, these two worlds are interconnecting. And they're interconnecting partly because of this emergence of an alignment, but a structural alignment, I would say, between China and Russia, but a realization, let's say amongst Europeans, that if we don't take Indo-Pacific security seriously, then America at some point will say, well, look, if you're not going to take Indo-Pacific security seriously, you guys look after Europe. Yeah? And we'll be there in the background, but we'll focus on Indo-Pacific. So the Europeans are going, no, okay, don't worry. We're also committed to Indo-Pacific security, now especially because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And on the other hand, if you are in Japan or in South Korea, and you try to say, oh yes, please help us with China, but you want to keep a good relationship with Russia, which Japan tried to do, famously under Shinzo Abe, that just does not fit anymore with an America that sees Russia as a real enemy. So you had that amazing moment in the Madrid summit of NATO last year of the prime ministers of Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, Japan, all coming to Madrid for a conference, as we described, focused on war with Russia. And then you had that same NATO summit for the first time call out China as a future challenge, but there's a lot more word to it, to the future of transatlantic security. So these two worlds are knitting together, and we heard in the opening roundtable, AUKUS, the Quad, the G7 plus concept. The G7 is now starting to invite Australia and South Korea more regularly to the meetings. There are joint sections. There's a much more of a connection between those two worlds. And this is going to be very important for business, as I'll explain in a minute. The fifth big thing about today, and again, a theme that I think was touched on in the last panel, in particular by Andrea, was the rest of the world in the last Cold War, and I kind of will use the term Cold War because I think that's kind of where we're going. It's an economic Cold War, but it's ideological, and I don't think there's going to be a better term. Is that in the last Cold War, the non-aligned countries, 77, had hardly any power, any influence, and their share of the economy was relatively small, as we discussed again earlier this morning. This time, it's 145 countries, and they have agency They reckon this time, you know what? We can triangulate. We can play one side off the other. We don't have to follow one or the other. Neutral? I don't know. Maybe that's too strong a term, but they're definitely non-aligned. And you can see this, again, through the steps that Saudi Arabia has taken, Turkey, a NATO member, striking a new economic agreement with Russia just recently, increasing massively its energy imports, probably acting as definitely acting as a throughput for exports from other parts of the world into Russia. India, we discussed earlier, and Brazil. I mean, again, we can give examples later on, but you know the examples. But what's interesting is that group of countries right now feel they have agency, that they can kind of do what they want, and they can. Let me give you one moment that really crystallized this reality in my mind, which was about 1.5 years ago, when Liz Truss, I will simply mention her name very quickly here. She was only briefly Prime Minister of Britain, obviously, but she was Foreign Secretary of the UK for a bit longer. And when I was director of Chatham House, I chaired her first foreign policy speech. And she explained in it that her whole speech was called The Network of Liberty. Yeah, so that sounds good. Good for the newspapers. Network of Liberty. But then in the speech, she said, Britain, now it's out of the EU, must be relentlessly commercial. Never stop. So, first question was an obvious question, Foreign Secretary. How can we be network of liberty and relentlessly commercial, especially if you want to be less commercial with the EU? And I thought that was going to be a good question. But she looked for a second, and then without hesitation, she said, I don't think that's a problem. She said, there are those countries out there that are trying to undermine our democracy and the international rule of law. Russia and China. Then there are other countries that have a different system of government to ours, but are not trying to undermine democracy or the rule of law. With those countries, we can do whatever we want. Now, if you're sitting in Saudi Arabia, or even if you're sitting in Delhi, you think, well, that's a license to do what we want at home, because we know that the battle against China and Russia is so intense that America, Britain, the EU will do whatever it takes to keep those other countries on side. So this is not a war or whatever, a struggle between democracies and autocracies. It really is about Russia and China and the 3 or 4 countries that support them, Venezuela, Iran, North Korea, and then us and the rest. So very quickly, 6th key point. We discussed it, so I won't say much about it. Global institutions cannot help. They cannot help right now. The IMF can't fix the debt crisis because the Chinese don't accept that IMF is made whole on any debts that are restructured, whereas Chinese state-owned banks, etc., have to take some of the cost. The WTO was mentioned in the last panel. The G20 is split. So what we've ended up with was a sort of fragmentation, I said, of a G7 plus, of a Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the BRICS, which somehow is sort of in between, and of course EU strategic autonomy, which is also potentially a pole in this new world. And my last 7th point, which I think is so different about today, before we get to the future, is that Europe and America, the 2 great champions of globalization, the great champions of open markets, have now focused entirely on economic security in this geopolitical divided world. They focused entirely on their own growth and their capacity to grow at home by moving into an industrial policy you've never seen before. We mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act. I'd say the EU as well, repurposing its resilience fund, its Recovery and Resilience Fund, the Repower EU, its own critical minerals movements, etc. If you're sitting in Europe, you can't afford to fall behind America and China on green tech as well as on digital tech. The whole idea was Europe was meant to lead on green tech, but now we risk falling behind on digital, on green as well as digital. Where are we going? Second big, what are the next steps? I just want to bring out 4 ideas about the future, which I think tie then into the next phase. Let's say something quickly about the Ukraine war, because it's important. As long as it continues, this divided world gets more and more figé, as you say in France, stuck, yeah? Must be a good Spanish word for that. That's why I'm speaking in English. I can't think of it. In any case, it gets more and more encrusted, yeah, in place. Putin has managed to convince himself, as well as the world, that he's at war with NATO, not with Ukraine. He's managed to convince his people he is at war with NATO and not with Ukraine. His economy is doing okay for now. Only dropped 3% roughly of GDP last year. He's opening up new trading relationships. The BRICS is stronger. He's on the advance in many parts of the world, including Africa. He probably has a better chance of doing really well in the 2024 election, which we assume he's going to stand for, if his country is still in conflict with Ukraine than if it's at peace. And one other thing I heard the other day, which I thought was a really interesting point. We keep waiting maybe for the technocrats to maybe, you know, say to him, look, this is unaffordable, we've got to change the war. But somebody said to me, the technocrats that are still living in Russia fear the accountability that would come with peace more than they fear the costs of war's continuation. The costs of accountability for many of those people of having supported this brutal war is worse than just living with it. And that's a really depressing thought. So I think Putin is digging in. He can't lose, let's put it that way. And nor, for that matter, though, can Ukraine. They also have elections coming up. 90% of Ukrainians right now, by most polls, 90% believe Ukraine can win. Not just you should keep fighting, but they can fight and win. To try and find some meeting place between those two, which is why Xi Jinping has put his little 12-point peace plan out there. Doesn't really matter. Looks good. He's not expecting anything to come from it. As he said, I'll wait till the time is and the circumstances are right. So my sense is that this could continue. The only outcome I can foresee right now that is feasible is somewhere between the Korea model, which I'm sure we've all read about, North Korea, South Korea, armistice line, or another idea that's out there, and this was an idea put forward by François Isbourg, and I thought it was a very good idea. Well, a very good projection. It's not a good idea. But is that it could be the Germany option. The Germany in the Cold War. Germany, when it was partitioned, never gave up the idea of unification. But in order to not keep pushing for it in the 50s, they said, all right, we won't push for unification. We will accept separation for the moment, but we need to be incorporated into Western institutions. So we want to be part of NATO. We want to be part of the EU. So the price, almost, if you see what I'm saying, of Ukraine agreeing to some type of ceasefire, even if it isn't a peace, is that it is then in I'm a European, in our institutions. Yeah? And if it is in our institutions, that dividing line stays really hard. So that's my sense of where that's going. China is, and I think it was Carlota who made this point, China is not sitting back in the face of encirclement, as it described it. Encirclement, suppression, and containment, Xi Jinping described it. They're not sitting back. They're on the offensive. They think this is a moment of opportunity. Xi Jinping's comment, which was recorded and taped, so it was prepared, the comment he made as he left Moscow 2-3 weeks ago, as he said to Putin at the airport, changes are happening in the world, the likes of which we have never seen in 100 years. You and we are driving these changes. And that is the world we heard in the last roundtable of what they call the more democratic world order, or multipolar, but one in which Western influence declines from military through to the dollar. And it's a plan, and China will do this with Russia. So they're on the offensive. The Iran-Saudi deal is a very clever way of doing many things, but in any case, it was a good moment. I haven't got time to talk about it more now. As we've discussed, they've got their Global Development Initiative. Andrea was talking about the Global Security Initiative. They've got a National Development Bank instead of the World Bank. They are moving forward. They will not overplay the Russia card. They will not give us the excuse to sanction them. But they don't need to. The world is changing in their favor without them having to intervene. And my quick comment on Taiwan is that I think they can afford to wait. And it's very interesting, the last set of exercises after the most recent visit by Tsai Ing-wen to California, the Chinese didn't, do drills about invasions. They did drills to have their aircraft carrier on the east side of Taiwan to really be able to show that they're moving towards some type of blockade capacity, if nothing else. And I think that change is incredibly a moment. 2027 is an important date for Xi Jinping as a date in which to say, at that moment, China would be capable of deterring America if things escalated. That's what 2027, I think, means for him, rather than being ready to invade. But again, we can interpret a lot of things around that. The third big point of where we're going is that I think Europe and the United States will remain united in opposition to Russia. Russia remains on the other side of that Iron Curtain, and that will be both America and Europe will think that. But support for Ukraine, obviously, is fraying. Hopefully that was well translated. It's getting weaker, it's getting rough at the edges. And that's not transatlantic. It's within America, it's within Europe. This isn't a transatlantic dispute. This is just a change in the weather. Where I could see things going, even towards the tail end of this year, you could have a ceasefire before the end of 2023, as I said a minute ago. But at that point, in a way, America hands over responsibility for Ukraine to Europe, much more. And the danger for that is it's a danger for Europe, of a sort, because supporting Ukraine's military operations and its budget deficit will cost about 10% of what reconstruction is going to cost. And Europe will have to pay the bulk of the reconstruction. And the only way that you can justify spending that much money is if Ukraine is inside the EU and that you know that money is properly spent. And that is going to cause all sorts of problems, as we know, inside the EU. Not just for France, but for Poland as well, as we've seen with their agriculture bans just recently on Ukrainian grain and so on. So I could see a ceasefire by the end of this year. I could see Europe stepping up, but the really tough work would then start, never mind how you'd manage this going forward. I think what we're likely to see is, the last point I was going to make, is this idea of transatlantic division over China. Honestly, I think the Biden administration is in the same place as most European governments. What the Biden administration has wanted to do is to clarify, to try and put strategic competition, Kevin Rudd's term, to try and put strategic competition between the US and China on a predictable footing for the future. But that's incredibly difficult to do when, at the same time, the US Congress treats China as a form of competition in a bipartisanly split country. So being in America right now is like being in the Sputnik moments of the 1950s. You know, when people kept saying, you let the Russians get ahead. No, you let Russians get ahead. And you had to spend more and spend more. The problem is spending more gets tied up with Taiwan. I'm not worried about what Xi Jinping is planning to do with Taiwan in terms of military intervention. I'm worried about what would happen is if America does something really provocative in support of Taiwan that humiliates Xi Jinping, that means Xi Jinping then has to do something to show the Communist Party is not being humiliated. In that sense, Macron was right. Macron was saying what most people in Europe think. We do not want our China policy hostage to American domestic politics. The thing is, he shouldn't have said it. He should have thought it and not said it. But if you invite a French president to China for 3 days, by the third day, the glory of France, just becomes bigger than anything. But the long and the short of it is that Europeans cannot afford to take on China and Russia simultaneously. And that reality, economically, is different from America's. It means we will always, as Europeans, have a different approach. We just need to keep it quiet and coordinate as much as we can. Let me get a little bit into the risks stuff, the last part, the business bit. So how does globalization cope with all of this? I think there are some risks and there are some opportunities. For numbers, let me give 3 risks, 3 opportunities. Keeps it simple for me. First of all, on the risks, obviously, US-China, something is happening. What word do we want to use? Decoupling, de-risking? I think de-risking, sort of von der Leyen's term, is the more accurate term, even for America, by the way. But that is happening and ongoing. And what it does, in particular for companies, is that you're forced, in a way, to align. It is going to be incredibly difficult for companies to have a different approach to what they do in the US market to what they're doing towards the China market. In sensitive sectors, that's going to become more and more difficult, as ASML has discovered, as the same lithography semiconductor manufacturing company did in Japan. Both sides are trying to take steps to limit the capacity of Chinese investment into their market. That means that who you pick, at the moment, is meant to be preventing state-owned enterprises. But is a private Chinese company as private as it was in 2023 as in 2017? Now that the Communist Party is actively involved in helping manage these companies, as the money is continuing to be lent, where is the red line of what is permitted to be sold into China and what is not? I'll give you one example. I know a lot of Americans thought that finance was in the green lane. Finance should be okay. It's not weapons, it's not high technology. But now the Biden administration is starting to think, hold on, if American financial companies help China deal with their demographic crisis and help with their pensions, then in a way China gets stronger. And China has more money to spend on its military. So maybe we don't want American financial companies to be quite so active. So, and what about Chinese batteries? A lot of the Inflation Reduction Act, you remember, is not simply about forcing companies to invest in America for the energy transition. But if you accept any of those tax breaks, you cannot sell similar equipment into China for 10 years. So, that could be a battery technology. That could be something that is not tied to military activities. So this de-risking may be about governments trying to de-risk their exposure to each other, but it is up-risking the risks for companies. Yeah? And you need to obviously be very aware of this. Second big issue, of course, is China's doing the same. China is also de-risking. And sure, at the moment, they might take in European companies, but if you're the Chinese leadership, would you trust European companies in the long term if you know that European companies, if they're forced by America, will go on the American side? Yeah? So the dual circulation, to use that term, this idea of trying to build up China's own internal capacity in even second generation, third generation chip making, etc., they are trying to make sure they don't have to depend on America or Europe. And that gives them a lot more flexibility to treat European companies differently over the long term. The third risk about the geopolitical environment is that there are spillovers and spoilers. The spillovers, obviously, is that, as the Christine Lagarde noted, we're likely to see inflation baked into this world of de-risking. And that inflation is going to affect poorer countries around the world in particular, but it's going to affect pocketbooks. So some of that optimistic idea about the global economy, the IMF has said a decoupled, de-risked world is going to knock about 25%, 30% off future global growth. Let's say average instead of 3.8, 3%. Again, that's a bit of a headwind for companies. There's also a more geopolitical type of risk. If you're in North Korea right now, you think, you know what? I can cause trouble. I can cause trouble, and I'm not going to get into trouble. Because China right now would probably quite like to have the Americans be distracted by new missile flights over Japan, or maybe some little intervention over the border or whatever. North Korea, one of those countries that always worries me for obvious reasons. This is a time where it has more capacity to cause mischief in the geopolitical divide than it did when China and America and the West were trying to work together. Same could go about Iran, etc. Not towards Saudi Arabia, but towards Israel. On opportunities, and I'm going to finish with the opportunities, it says time's up, so I'll just give 2 minutes on the opportunities. I think the world that we're seeing right now for globalization, I'll be interested to see what the next panel thinks about this, you could end up with sort of layered globalization, sort of layers. And the part of the world that is experimenting with layered globalization is Southeast Asia, ASEAN and Asia Pacific. A country like Japan is inside that G7 exclusive community at the top that is trying to develop new critical supply chains, new 6G technologies, new standards for managing AI. Japan can be in that top community. And maybe if they can trade with each other in that top end around some pretty big markets and not be worried about being hit by American sanctions. But they're also in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now, that does not include China, but does have protections against state-owned enterprises, does have protection for intellectual property, does allow e-commerce because you're protecting private identity and you don't need data localization as much, etc. So it's a sort of halfway house, but it has Vietnam, an autocracy, alongside Canada and democratic governments in there as well. And then you've got the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, a region-wide agreement discussed in the last panel, where China is in there, as well as Japan, South Korea, Australia. And there you can trade pretty much everything. Now 65% of products at zero tariffs. And there is free trade for tourism, telco, and some other financial services and so on. So you've seen huge, IMF is predicting 6.5% growth in ASEAN. And investment in ASEAN is up to pre-pandemic levels at 175 billion. India, obviously, is another big opportunity. They can play between the two sides. You know that. We can talk maybe more about it in the Q&A. They had their highest ever level of foreign direct investment in 22, $85 billion. As we know, people have been very cautious about India for good reason. The Gulf states have an extra $1.3 trillion to spend over the next 4 years. Extra. They're making so much money from oil and so on right now. Some of the South American countries, which I know you operate in, they can benefit maybe from American growth, like Mexico, or they can also benefit from the green energy transition, and they can benefit from a pickup in China's growth. Africa was mentioned in the last panel, continental free trade agreement, but now, interestingly, America and Europe are competing with China on infrastructure investment. And the EU, with this global gateway, is trying to invest in renewable minerals, critical minerals, fiber connectivity, satellite services. The EU's finally woken up to Africa, and that gives opportunities for companies to come in behind. I think China can ride the tiger. China, I think economically, is actually going to do quite well in the next few years. The government is determined that it should be open to foreign investment. And then, I suppose the last question is whether this G7 plus group of countries I was describing can actually follow through on some of their own deeper economic cooperation around technology, around maybe medical data sharing, and in other, the critical minerals, where it's very interesting to see the US and the EU, they might have a disagreement over the Inflation Reduction Act, but if the European Commission and the Biden administration can agree on the conditions under which rare earth minerals are brought into products, then they may not be subject to the same punitive steps and disadvantages that American companies are not suffering from in America. So, to conclude, companies are now operating in a, obviously, geopolitically divided world. It's more zero-sum than it was before. There is opportunity in what I'm describing, I think, as layered globalization. The danger is, as I said, governments know what the layers are, but companies may find that these layers move and sectors go up and down. So really, as companies, you don't know what the escalatory ladder is. We are at the bottom of an escalatory ladder that could go up between China and America, dragging everyone else with it, or between Russia and America, dragging everyone else up it. And so a good investment at one moment could turn up to be a very difficult one later, and you're going to have to explore the regulatory environment, the political environment, country by country, sector by sector. And you need to be prepared for the fact that governments will use economic instruments and companies themselves as the main instruments in this geopolitical competition. We're in a nuclear-armed world, and economics is the tool, yeah? So you are part of the tools that will be used in this geopolitical world. So it leaves, my final comment, the following dilemma, and I think it's particularly a dilemma for Spanish companies, for European companies, and for American companies. There are two extremes you have to swim between. In one, you ignore your values. You ignore the values of Spain or of Europe. You follow the rules required in autocratic markets. You do what Apple does. China's too important. Whatever the Chinese government says, you'll do, or Volkswagen, won't worry too much about Xinjiang. You do what you have to do. But you get the near-term economic benefits, but you run the risk of societal, political backlash at some particular point in your home country. And, of course, at some point, there could be a deep disruption, because I believe, and I think most people believe, autocratic governments, they may be stable, but they're stable till they're not. And when they're not, it tends to be drastic, yeah, and extreme, as all of those companies who invested in Russia found out. And Chatham House, myself, and others were telling people, don't go in there, it's going to happen. It happened. Maybe they made enough money before they had to lose their money. Who knows? Every company's different. The other option, of course, is to take the other track. You commit to being part of that liberal democratic community. You ensure that those values that are represented mostly by most of your staff, as well as your governments, are aligned. You at least reduce your exposure to those markets, especially those ones that could get caught up in this geopolitical divide. You could invest in governments that are not undermining international law and democracy, but you have to really watch out for investing in China. But at least you're reducing your exposure to that longer-term turbulence, that risk of the escalatory ladder catching you. So it's not either or, it's not black or white, but the shade of gray is going to be incredibly important. So leaving a shade of gray, I think I'll stop there, Ricardo, and we'll do some questions. Thank you very much.
Bueno, enhorabuena, congrats por esta fantástica intervención. A mí lo que más me gusta es esa capacidad que tienes de ponerte en la posición de todos los actores que participan para intentar anticipar qué es lo que puede ocurrir en base a sus intereses, ¿no? y cómo entre todos ellos conforman esta globalización por capas, como la has llamado tú, ¿no? Me parece muy interesante. Yo, la verdad es que tengo una pregunta que no es de las que están ahí, que me permito el lujo de hacerte. Y es, dentro de esta posición que tiene China, donde trata un poco de ir captando socios que comulguen con estas nuevas reglas y este orden, a mí me merece un asombro y un especial interés el reciente acuerdo que han alcanzado Arabia Saudí e Irán, precisamente promovido por China, ¿no? Y eso te demuestra que realmente pueden cambiar las cosas mucho más allá de lo que de lo que todos esperábamos o se esperaba, ¿no? ¿Cómo ves tú en este mundo de capas esa relación entre Oriente Medio, ahora, en este nuevo Oriente Medio, y la OTAN o la comunidad occidental?
Bueno, voy a intentar un poquito en español. Lo más interesante para mí de este acuerdo fue el hecho es que cada país ganó algo. Una de las preocupaciones que yo tenía al principio de 2023 es mirando cómo los árabes sauditas estaban invirtiendo cantidades enormes, decía antes, la cantidad de dinero que tienen. No quieren invertirlo tanto en los Estados Unidos ahora, por razones que comprendemos, pero estaban construyendo una infraestructura económica, turística, transporte, que se convertía en cada semana en un cible más grande para Irán. Los iraníes ya habían atacado en 2019 la infraestructura petrolífera, pero en el futuro no habría 2 o 3 cibles, habría muchos más. Una decena. Entonces, para ellos necesitaban un tipo de acuerdo con Irán, sino ¿quién va a invertir en este futuro de Arabia Saudita? Pero claro, los chinos, China dependiendo mucho de Arabia Saudita para el petróleo, claro, también no quiere este tipo de guerra, y los iraníes, que necesitan exportar también su petróleo a China, están en una posición de hacer el acuerdo. Entonces, yo creo en este momento, si estás en el Medio Oriente, sabes que para los Estados Unidos el Medio Oriente no es el plano principal geopolítico, que no tienen interés económico como tenían antes y no lo tendrán en el futuro si vamos a un mundo más verde, de economía verde. El país que sí va a necesitar y estará involucrado de manera más importante será China. Entonces, importante tomar esta oportunidad sabiendo que en la gran guerra global de geopolítica los americanos no van a abandonar ni punir, no.
Sí, castigar.
Castigar demasiado, y no los han castigado, los del Medio Oriente. Entonces, hemos visto con Abu Dhabi, UAE, Egipto, también con Arabia Saudí, están en esta posición. Empujando más hacia China, es el futuro, saben que no van a perder los Estados Unidos, pero no se fían de ellos.
Muy interesante. Y lo pagamos todos en la petrol station, ¿eh?
Sí, para el momento, pero eso es, como decía bien, there's a dilemma entre el corto plazo y largo plazo. Estamos pagando ahora para, yo creo, espero no tener que pagar tanto en el futuro.
Muy bien.
Bueno, estamos pagando. Gente está pagando más que otros, ya lo comprendo.
Vamos con la primera pregunta. Dice, ¿es Estados Unidos una potencia en decadencia? ¿En qué ámbitos tiene una ventaja indiscutible sobre China y en cuáles China le puede superar?
Mira, tenemos no mucho tiempo, bueno, usted está manejando el tiempo, pero lo que yo diría es Estados Unidos no es una potencia en decadencia, es una potencia que está volviendo a su estado natural, que es estar ocupado con sí mismo. Y China, que necesita el mundo exterior mucho más que antes, está entrando en los espacios que los americanos están abandonando, digamos. Estados Unidos sí necesita aliados fundamentales, y lo bueno del Biden Administration que lo comprende, que su seguridad depende de aliados. Pero los aliados, como decías, 30, 40, ya estamos, de países mundialmente. Todo el resto es too difficult, too complicated. Y como tenemos esta división política tan profunda en los Estados Unidos, claro, están mucho más enfocados en sí mismos, aún más de lo normal. Entonces, pero si mira, a la potencia de energía, rare earth metals, oil, gas, food, water, people, immigration, todo. Los Estados Unidos no está en decadencia, está perdiendo parte de su influencia global, pero mantiene su capacidad interna, incluso militar. Y creativa de tecnología.
De innovación.
Sí, innovación, todo eso. Y hay dos Estados Unidos, claro. Una parte que quiere tomar ventaja de estas ventajas y utilizarlas globalmente. Para los políticos que dicen no, vamos a limitarlo. Y de eso es lo que estaba diciendo yo antes.
Hay una pregunta fantástica, yo creo que como se ha ido el tiempo, la tengo que hacer porque me parece buenísima y es la última. Y es, ¿tenemos que resignarnos a que el papel de Europa se reduzca a ser una potencia regulatoria o tenemos posibilidades de competir en el nuevo contexto global? It's a good question.
That's a good question. Yo siempre, cuando he tenido que escribir sobre strategic autonomy and all of these things, I usually say Europe is a commercial power and it should be proud of it. En un mundo dividido global, un mundo geopolítico, un mundo geoestratégico, la geoeconomía es importantísimo. Y la realidad es que la Unión Europea no es un país. No creo que va a ser un país como un país. Y entonces el sistema de gobierno siempre va a ser muy complicado. Y en hecho, la capacidad de empujar, digamos, un papel realmente geopolítico de potencia al lado de China y Estados Unidos, no lo veo. No creo que será posible. Si tenemos que defendernos, nos defenderemos bien, europeos. Pero ser una potencia es poder empujar tu influencia hacia afuera. Y de ese lado, la capacidad de cambiar el punto de vista del mundo chino o de Rusia, como hemos visto, es muy limitado. Pero lo que me preocupa, entonces, podríamos ser una potencia regulatoria y económica. Claro, el problema con ser una potencia económica es que, in relative terms, we're a smaller proportion, una proporción más pequeña del PIB global en cada año. Pero nos mantendremos bastante grande, si somos 500 millones, bla, 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 más o menos. Y habrá, yo creo en el futuro, veo una pregunta, pero lo voy a mezclar porque veo en 5 o 10 años la Unión Europea, el Reino Unido y la Unión Europea se habrán bueno, que no rejoin. That's gone. Pero Norway, Britain, Ukraine, there will be connections, there will be new types of free trade agreements. We'll be more coordinated. It's going to happen, for sure.
Aligned.
Because of the world beyond. We have no choice. And in that sense, I think Europe will be able to have influence in its own region. It will be a swing player in the Indo-Pacific as America's ally. It will be America's principal ally globally. That's important. If the G7 plus becomes a community, Europe will be an equal partner economically in that community, in regulation, in standard setting, which is very important. If Europe is going to be a global power, it needs to think vertically. It's got to stop thinking laterally. It's got to think about Africa. Europe, unless Europe helps fix or give an opportunity for Africa to be all that Africa could be, and all of the African countries, and the difficult that's going to be, we're going to end up like Mad Max land, behind a giant Rio Grande, there'll be the Mediterranean. I mean, it's honestly, the future with climate change and so on is bleak. So we keep measuring ourselves against the wrong reto. We keep thinking as big as America, as big as China. If we can't think about how we work with Africa and with partners, maybe with China, with America, that's fine, but we will really end up as our own enclosed island, like America. We will become our own bubble. So that's one of my biggest worries. I'm afraid that technologically, we've lost the race for the platforms, and probably for AI. I think it's gone. It's too late. It's going to be like the platforms before. AI will be in the future. So we will regulate, and maybe we can partner here and there with American companies. But Europe cannot come together, I'm afraid, being what it is, fast enough to create the data sets and the skills and so on to be a leader in that space. So when you think of the different levels of geopolitical influence for Europe, military, we can defend, but we can't project much except alongside America. Technologically, we're We'll supply creativity to our allies and to America, and hopefully we'll be in a G7 of designing the standards. But our big future for ourselves and to deal with climate and our own security is we have to team up with Africa.
Muy bien. Bueno, pues ha pasado el tiempo, así es que vamos a despedir con un fuerte aplauso a Robin. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos.